Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello there, welcome to another week on Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, President Trump facing a war on many fronts. The special counsel, the courts, the Democrats, and of course, the media.
Also, is a civil war looming amongst the Democrats?
And as the next presidential campaign gets underway, will we be seeing Bernie 2020?
I think it might be a little odd if the most popular politician in our country didn't throw his hat in the ring.
Stephanie Kelton's one of the Bernie left's leading economists. We'll be sitting down with her for a fireside chat. But first, the news.
This week, President Trump and his lawyers submitted written answers to questions from special counsel Robert Mueller, investigating Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election and any possible collusion with Trump supporters. The questions related to the election campaign itself, not the possibility of obstruction of justice in the firing of FBI Director James Comey after it. President Trump telling Chris Wallace on Fox News it was no big deal.
I got the questions, I responded. We wrote them out. I read them once. I read them a second time. We made some changes. That's it. They're very simple. You know why? I did nothing wrong.
Still, the president says it is unlikely that he will sit for a face-to-face interview with Mueller or answer any questions on obstruction.
I think we've wasted enough time on this witch hunt.
But it is not up to the president. Mueller is expected to request a further interview and seek to subpoena the president if he resists. Although, to do that, Mueller needs the approval of the Department of Justice, and that's where Acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker comes in. Or it could ultimately go to the Supreme Court, testing the new Conservative majority. It seems to me, Chaz, as though the president is getting his ducks in a row right now.
They are all ready to quack. But remember, Senator Jeff Flake has a few ducks of his own. Flake announced last week that he'll block all judge confirmations until the Senate votes on a bill to protect the Mueller probe from any blowback in this battle. Jeff was feeling pretty good. All he needed was one Republican to support him. Unfortunately, Jeff Flake's got no friends and he got no support, so Mueller's still looking vulnerable.
Yeah, he certainly is. And speaking of James Comey, he got something of a Thanksgiving surprise earlier today in the form of a subpoena to appear before the House Judiciary Committee, and so too has former Attorney General in the Obama administration, Loretta Lynch. The pair have been called to appear in early December in closed session by the committee, which retains its Republican majority until January. Director Comey tweeting, he's happy to answer their questions, but he will resist a closed-door thing because he's seen enough of their selective leaking and distortion. He wants a public hearing. There was a remarkable public disagreement between President Trump and Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts this week. It began with a ruling by Judge John Tigger of the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco against the Trump administration's ban on accepting asylum claims made by those who cross the border illegally without documents.
Everybody that wants to sue the United States, they file their case in Olmos. They file their case in the Ninth Circuit, and it means an automatic loss, no matter what you do.
In an attack on judicial independence, President Trump described Tigger as an Obama judge. When asked for a reaction from the Associated Press, Justice Roberts issued this statement. We do not have Obama judges or Trump judges, Bush judges or Clinton judges. What we have is an extraordinary group of dedicated judges doing their level best to do equal right to those appearing before them. That independent judiciary is something we should all be thankful for. But President Trump wasn't backing down.
Sorry, Chief Justice John Roberts, but you do indeed have Obama judges, and they have a much different point of view than the people who are charged with the safety of our country.
And
there are a lot of criminals in the caravan. We will stop them, catch and detain. Judicial activism by people who know nothing about security and the safety of our citizens is putting our country in great danger. Not good.
Trump might be surprised about those Ninth Circuit judges. It turns out the Supreme Court has only granted review in well below 1% of the Ninth Circuit's cases. And when they have heard Ninth Circuit cases recently, it's only been the third most overturned circuit court out of 13. But I think it's worth focusing some more on what this judge said to make Trump so angry. As you said, John, the government has been trying to only let people claim asylum if they cross at legal checkpoints, which you might think is fair enough, except federal law specifically says that all people on US soil can apply for asylum no matter how or where they arrive. But there's more. Tigger noticed, Judge Tigger noticed, that the wording of Trump's executive order actually gives him the ability to stop asylum claims entirely along the southern border, which would also defy federal law. Another issue has been that it's one thing to say that asylum seekers should come through the official checkpoints, but it's quite another to say that when the administration has been turning asylum seekers away from those very same checkpoints for months, claiming that they're full. And we're seeing a perfect example of this bureaucratic quagmire playing out right now, because the first wave of that caravan that everyone was freaking out about a month ago has arrived in Tijuana, just south of California. Right now, there are about 3,000 people waiting in the queue there to enter America and apply for asylum. And there are about 7,000 more people expected to arrive over the next week or two. So what's the rate at which America's letting these people through the checkpoint for processing? About 40 to 100 people a day. These people are looking at 4 to 6 months waiting on the border just to get in. The strange thing about this is that with all these delays, you're already getting protests in Tijuana to get rid of these asylum seekers, calling them an invasion, etc. I suspect Trump might find it all deliciously ironic.
I just realised how much like Americans Mexicans really are. Now, what about her emails? News came this week that first daughter Ivanka Trump has been using a personal email account to do government business in breach of federal government rules. According to the Washington Post, a White House ethics review revealed throughout much of 2017, she often discussed official White House business using a private email account with a domain she shares with her husband, Jared Kushner. And Chaz, of course, this has drawn some comparisons this week to the whole Hillary Clinton private email server as Secretary of State controversy of 2015 and 2016.
It sure has. The Democrats are loving this one. They are tweeting modified Trump tweets with Ivanka's name penciled in. They're doing the whole lock her up thing. And by the way, Ivanka isn't the first Trump administration person to break the rules on using private email accounts. Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, Steve Miller, Reince Priebus, Gary Cohn and Scott Pruitt have all done it as well. But people are really focusing on Ivanka, possibly because she apparently claimed when she was caught last year that she had no idea she was breaking the rules. That is very hard for me to believe, given that Trump's 2016 campaign looked a little bit like this. Nevertheless, there are some important differences between Ivanka's emails and Hillary's emails that I think should be acknowledged. Ivanka used a private email account, but she didn't set up her own home email server like Hillary did, where she could keep her emails hidden if she wanted to. There's no evidence of Ivanka sending or receiving any classified material, whereas Hillary sent or received classified material at least 110 times. And finally, there's no evidence that Ivanka has deleted any of her emails, but Hillary deleted thousands of them. And Democrats, those are all important differences. Then again, there's something that those two have in common as well. Both Ivanka and Hillary asked their personal attorneys to review their private emails and decide which messages should be retained for government records. Neither of them used a neutral party, and that's dodgy. Because how do we know whether Ivanka's deleted emails or whether she sent classified material if no independent investigators have looked at them all? I'd say that the emails are at least worth checking out, even if it goes nowhere.
Now, to the latest battlefronts in President Trump's war on the media. The White House dropped their legal case to strip CNN correspondent Jim Acosta of his press credentials following this memorable exchange.
If I may ask
Peter,
one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
So, Acosta is back in, but the White House has announced new rules for questioning at such briefings. Journalists will ask a single question, then yield the floor. The President or White House official may grant an additional question, and unlike Jim Acosta, filibuster in that clip, you have to hand back the microphone straight away. Break the rules and you will lose your White House press pass. Meanwhile, President Trump engaged in a war of words with the architect of the raids that captured Saddam Hussein and killed Osama bin Laden, Admiral William McRaven, who claimed that President Trump's attacks on the press represent, quote, the greatest threat to democracy he's seen in his lifetime. The retired Navy SEAL and 37-year veteran saying, when you undermine the people's right to a free press and freedom of speech and expression, then you threaten the Constitution and all for which it stands. President Trump brushed that aside.
He's a Hillary Clinton backer and an Obama backer. Wouldn't it have been nice if we got Osama bin Laden a lot sooner than that?
As well as claiming that McRaven was a Hillary fan, he also said that he was on the shortlist to be her vice presidential running mate. A quick fact check on that. No, he wasn't. McRaven says he didn't support anyone in 2016, but that he supported all the presidents he served under of both parties. Finally, President Trump says that he might actually attend next year's White House Correspondents' Dinner after a 2-year boycott. This is because, in place of the usual comedian, the association announced this week a historian, Ron Chernow, will be the next MC of what they call Nerd Prom. President Trump says, yeah, he might actually return for that.
So-called comedian Michelle Wolf bombed so badly last year at the White House Correspondents' Dinner that this year, for the first time in decades, they will have an author instead of a comedian. Good first step in comeback of dying evening and tradition. Maybe I will go.
Just to tie a little bow on all of that, history recalls that in 2011, as President Barack Obama was taking digs like this at Donald Trump.
No one is happier, no one is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter. Like, did we fake the moon landing?
And, funnily enough, on that very night in 2011, Bill McRaven was commanding SEAL Team 6 as they prepared to go in and kill Osama bin Laden. So it's funny how things happen, Chaz.
Yeah, and by the way, McRaven wasn't fumbling around for 10 years looking for bin Laden like Trump suggested. He's just the guy they called to get him when they found him.
True.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
Two recent polls have placed former Vice President Joe Biden and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders as the two top picks for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. But here is the bad news for Joe and Bernie. Democrats hardly ever nominate their frontrunners, and when they do, they lose. It's almost like there's a curse. The Republican Party loves a frontrunner. In almost every election since the 1940s, the candidate leading the polls a year out gets the nomination. The exception being in 2007, when former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani led for most of the year but lost to John McCain in 2008.
Shocked.
And then there was late 2015, when Dr. Ben Carson overtook Donald Trump for just a week.
Carson ekes past Trump with Republicans 26% to 22% nationwide.
The old saying goes, Republicans fall in line while Democrats fall in love.
I have to tell you, I caused a few divorces.
In 1971, Senator George McGovern was in single digits behind Ted Kennedy, who didn't run, and Hubert Humphrey and Edmund Muskie, who did. McGovern's grassroots anti-war campaign took off and took him all the way to the nomination, but no further.
Nixon wins re-election to the presidency.
It hurts too much to laugh, but I'm too old to cry.
4 years later, Ted Kennedy again led the polls and again didn't run. And there was Hubert Humphrey, who didn't run but said he'd accept the nomination, and segregationist George Wallace. There are a whole bunch of others. In the end, the nomination went to former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter.
I pray that I can live up to your confidence and never disappoint you.
Well, Ted Kennedy, for one, was disappointed, and in 1980, he finally ran for president against Jimmy Carter.
That I'm a candidate for president of the United States.
Kennedy was the frontrunner by 30 points until his lacklustre campaign and the Iran hostage crisis gave Carter a boost. In 1984, Carter's Vice President Walter Mondale was the frontrunner all the way, although Gary Hart gave him a bit of a shock. Fritz secured the nomination but lost to President Reagan. In 1988, Gary Hart was the frontrunner until he dropped out over an alleged affair. The eventual nominee, Michael Dukakis, had just 10% support at the time.
Runs the blood.
In 92, California Governor Jerry Brown was out in front a year out. He lost the nomination to Bill Clinton, but not before taking a swing at Hillary.
I don't care what you say about me, but you ought to be ashamed of yourself for jumping on my wife.
And I need your vote.
In 2000, Clinton's Veep Al Gore led all the way over Senator Bill Bradley, but like Mondale in 84, he was a frontrunner who won the nomination but lost the election.
I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you.
4 years later, frontrunner Howard Dean led a McGovern-like anti-war movement. Senator John Kerry had only 11% support a month before the primaries, but voters preferred the Vietnam veteran to the peacenik.
I'm John Kerry, and I'm reporting for duty.
I don't think I'm that bad.
2008 frontrunner Hillary Clinton was run down by Barack Obama. She stayed in front of Bernie Sanders when she ran a second time in 2016, but of course still lost to Donald Trump.
And I'm sorry that we did not win this election for the values we share and the vision we hold for our country.
The bottom line, unless they're already president, Democrat frontrunners have a terrible record. Most don't get nominated, and those that do don't get elected. It's the curse of the frontrunner. Now, talking of Democrats, it seems like Nancy Pelosi's prospects of returning to the House speakership have brightened considerably. The week began with 16 current and incoming House Democrats signing a pledge to vote against Pelosi. Ohio Congresswoman Martha Fudge said that she was getting lots of calls from colleagues calling on her to run.
I have been overwhelmed with people. It has been heartwarming and humbling.
Heartwarming and humbling. But then reports emerged that Fudge had previously written a letter of support for an Ohio judge and politician who is now accused of killing his ex-wife. Fudge asked for leniency in sentencing for Lance Mason, who had at the time been accused of brutally beating his ex-wife, who is now accused of killing. And now, surprise, surprise, Martha Fudge has announced she will be supporting Nancy Pelosi. And by week's end, those calling for somebody other than Pelosi to run are mostly falling into line chairs.
Everything is coming up Pelosi. Firstly, as you said, John, there have been 16 Democrats all along who have been committed to voting against Pelosi in the final congressional floor vote. Now, maybe they wouldn't go through with it, but even if they would oppose Pelosi the whole way, the Democrats are now closing in on their 234th seat, which means they have 16 votes to spare.
Handy.
These guys don't have the numbers to stop her, even if they did all stick together, and one of them has already flipped anyway. Talking about numbers, this week's polling is looking a lot better for Pelosi as well. 53% of Democrats this week would now like to see Pelosi as the next speaker. And if those numbers aren't clear enough, try the numbers at ringleader Seth Moulton's town hall this week.
The majority of Americans want this change. The majority of Democrats want this change. We want
I think they made their thoughts pretty clear, John.
Seth 2020.
No way. And with Pelosi still not facing an opponent, she's looking pretty home to me.
Yeah, all right, let's update some of the numbers because more than 2 weeks after the midterm elections, the results have still been dribbling in. Chris Collins, you remember him? He was the Republican accused of insider trading. He has been declared the winner in New York 27 by less than 3,000 votes over Democrat Nate McMurray. In another close race we've been watching, Utah Congresswoman Mia Love, a Republican, has lost her district to Democrat Ben McAdams by fewer than 700 votes. One House district is still to be called, though. That's New York 22, but Anthony Brindisi looks to have won that for the Democratic Party over Republican Claudia Tenney. So, If we put that into the blue column, the Democrats have 234 House seats to the Republicans' 201. That is a shift of 39 seats to the Democratic Party.
And while we're at it, some more updated numbers. The popular vote margin is now at 8%, or 8.9 million votes, an all-time midterms record, although obviously there are more people voting now than there were in the past. The turnout rate is now the highest for a midterm since 1914. So combine those two stats, and the total votes for House Democrats is 59.3 million, which is getting real close to the total votes John McCain won in 2008 and Mitt Romney won in 2012. With several million votes left to be counted, they might even reach Donald Trump's total from 2016, and that would be unheard of. A congressional party getting more votes in the midterms than the sitting president. On to the push for more women in politics. Women are getting very close to holding the majority in both the Colorado House and the Nevada Assembly, which is noteworthy. As for the Democrats doing well in the suburbs, here is another way of looking at it. These are some of the figures associated with Democratic and Republican districts before the election. You can see the Democratic districts produce more GDP, have higher incomes, have more college graduates, and have less manufacturing workers. Now, look what happens when we compare those figures to the districts the Democrats flipped from the Republicans this election. You can see those flipped districts in purple are also productive, wealthy, well-educated, and not into manufacturing. When the Democrats take the suburbs, it's especially the successful suburbs. A class divide may well be opening up here. But a divide is closing here. In 2015, 88% of black people in Congress were in majority-minority districts. But this election, all 9 new black members elected were in districts with less than 21% black people. 8 of those districts were not majority-minority districts. That is good to see. Finally, I want to say something about the internal battle brewing in the Democrats between the left and the centrists. In the midterms, the left pointed to how much Senate moderates Joe Donnelly, Claire McCaskill and Heidi Heitkamp struggled to hold their seats, and that is true. But those were tough races, and McCaskill ran 7 points better than Hillary did in 2016. Donnelly ran 7 points ahead of Clinton, and Heitkamp went 17 points better than Hillary did. And how about the left? If we look at the scorecard that progressive activist Sean McKelvey set for progressive candidates, they only won 1 of those races. Mind you, many of them were close. So does that mean the left failed? Well, no, because if you look at the successive endorsements from America's biggest politicians, Donald Trump saw 56% of his endorsees win, Barack Obama saw 61% of his endorsees win, Bernie Sanders had an amazing 71% of his endorsees win. By the way, Bernie also had the highest percentage of wins for candidates he campaigned for. Also, sometimes candidates with grassroots support can help drive turnout for races further down the ballot. Take Beto O'Rourke, for example. He didn't win, sure, but in Texas, Colin Allred flipped a House seat where the Democrats didn't even field a candidate in 2016. And Lizzie Pennell Fletcher won a seat the Democrats hadn't held since 1964. Plus, there are a bunch of other victories, so maybe O'Rourke's progressivism helped there. There's probably no simple answer to left versus centrism for the Democrats, John, but I will note this. 27% of Democratic candidates in 2010 wanted to expand Medicare. Today, it's 58%. 19% of Democratic candidates in 2010 received an F rating from the NRA. Today, it's 52%. It's possible the very definition of what a moderate is changing, and the Democrats' policy window is changing with it.
Well, joining us this week for our fireside chat is one of the most influential and indeed controversial economists in America today, Stephanie Kelton. Welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
Your big idea, at least the shorthand, Googleable version of your big idea, is that contrary to conventional thought, governments can't run out of money. Therefore, they should spend more of it on people and good things like that. Critics say that's magic money tree thinking. It won't work. It's crazy. What are they missing?
Well, I guess they're missing that it's not my idea. It's not my theory. It actually comes from people like, I don't know, say Alan Greenspan, who used to be chair of the Federal Reserve. I mean, I could give you a laundry list of people, Republicans, conservatives, who recognize that the government can create money. I mean, that's not really a controversial idea. I think maybe it's the second part of what you said that gets controversial, in that you say, well, because the government has the power of the purse, it ought to deploy that power in the interest of raising the standard of living in the country, of serving the people, So that gets a bit controversial, because some people think the government, of course, can't do anything right. They can't create jobs. They don't do anything. And so it's all wasteful and, that sort of thing. So that's where the controversy comes in.
But you don't think it's like a magic money pot you're going to spend forever? I know there's a limit, according to you as well.
Yeah.
So what is the limit?
So, well, the limit is it's internally imposed on you by your economy, right? You only have so many people who you can put to work. There are only so many machines and factories and raw materials, steel and concrete. So if you want to, do some big ambitious infrastructure investment program and spend a couple of $1 trillion modernizing and upgrading your infrastructure, you've got to make sure that you have contractors, engineers, architects, steel, machines, all that stuff available. Because if all that stuff's already being used somewhere else in the economy and the government comes in and tries to hire it all up and do big infrastructure, it's going to end up creating an inflation problem. So the answer to the question is the limit is inflation.
So you're saying that people look at the wrong measure. They look at the debt. You're saying they should look at inflation rather than the debt.
Absolutely. So when we look at proposals for legislation, we ask our fiscal watchdog is the Congressional Budget Office. And so they'll evaluate a piece of proposed legislation, and the feedback that they give lawmakers to help them make a decision about whether to vote yes or no for this legislation is what it will do to the deficit and what will it do to the national debt. Instead, they should be giving them really useful advice, like what will it do to inflation if we go forward with this much spending over this period of time? What will it do to inequality? Will it exacerbate existing levels of income and wealth inequality? What would it do to child poverty? Would it lift millions of kids? Give them some useful metrics to help them make decisions instead of always and only talking about how will it impact the deficit.
There's also a lot of talk at the moment about the idea of a jobs guarantee. And, the obvious top-line pushback to that is jobs guarantee, then, you have problems with productivity, it's creating make work, there's a reason for people to want to do these kind of jobs at $15 an hour and so on. The whole system will go kaput if you guarantee people a job. What do you say?
Well, the productivity rate for someone who's unemployed is 0. So it's pretty hard to not improve upon that by putting people to work. So I don't think that's a very credible argument. What we're talking about is taking millions of people, in the case of the U.S., who are involuntarily unemployed. That is, they want to work, they want to find a way to contribute and work in the economy, but they can't find a job anywhere else in the economy. And that's always going to be the case. The private sector is going to hire up to the point where they think it's profitable, and then they stop. And so what we're saying is that there's a way for the government to come in and make sure that everybody who wants to contribute, everyone who wants to work, is afforded that option. So the federal job guarantee is really a public option in the labor market. And we're saying, let's just set a threshold. Let's figure out a base wage and benefit package that keeps people doing something that's useful in their communities, that pays them a living wage. And the private sector then has to up their game. If you want to hold on to your workers, you've got to provide a minimum standard, which the government is guaranteeing to every American.
But if the government set the jobs guarantee wage at, say, $15 an hour, wouldn't that then create the inflation that you're talking about, you're trying to avoid?
It's interesting that the answer is no. And the only way that we can sort of get a sense of what the inflationary effects would be is to actually try to model it. I mean, that's what economists do, so that's what I did. I released a study earlier this year with some co-authors, and we did exactly this. And the study was called The Macroeconomic Effects of Public Service Employment. So what would happen if we actually had an open-ended job offer for every American who wanted work and couldn't find it anywhere else, and we paid $15 an hour, and we included some benefits like health care and child care and so forth. And so we ran it through very conventional models, and what ends up happening is that you don't get an inflationary problem. You get a one-time increase in prices, but it's very modest and it tapers off. But what you do end up with is a huge economic stimulus in the sense that your real economy grows, productivity increases, you get a little bit of upward pressure on wages, but nothing that creates the sort of inflation problem that you would worry about. So at $15 an hour, that seems like a very safe threshold.
Now, we just talked about the jobs guarantee, but there's plenty of other proposals that the left has put out over the last couple of years. There's Medicare for all, free college tuition, universal basic income, infrastructure package. Out of those five, they're the major ones, I'd say. Which would you say is the most important, and which would you say is the most likely to happen over the next decade or so?
Well, you know, the federal job guarantee is something that people are just beginning to talk about. We haven't really had that on the table for a while. It was part of the Democratic Party platform until about 1980, and then it fell off. So we're just beginning to sort of talk with people about that. So it doesn't have the same level of public support yet that something like Medicare for All has. Right now, Medicare for All is supported by 70% of Americans, which means it has broad bipartisan support. The neat thing, though, about the federal job guarantee is that by including health care, you're backdooring Medicare for All into the system. And so it's kind of a way to win on both with a single policy proposal. So that I might say that that's kind of the niftiest one in the sense that you get both.
Given that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was described at the time as socialised medicine and it took a long time to get majority support, do you think that in the next term of the next Democratic president, whenever that happens to be, the time will be right to take that extra step for universal health care, a government-mandated option, these kinds of things?
Like I said, so 70% of the American population is already there. So I call it a centrist position. It's already centrist in America to say we want single-payer universal health care, Medicare for all, whatever you want to call it. The American people are overwhelmingly already there. It's the politicians who need to move to the center and get where the rest of the populace is.
Which, of course, they're not. They're going further apart. And as soon as something becomes a political football, you've seen what's happened repeatedly, whether it was, you know, Harry Truman, Teddy Kennedy, the Clintons, and finally Obama. They've all tried to crack this nut of universal coverage in American healthcare. They just can't get there.
No, and the campaigns, you know how they run the commercials, and everybody becomes, you have to scare people into turning against this very popular idea by telling them you're actually going to end up with worse health care, you're not going to be able to see a doctor, you're not going to get the treatments you need, it's going to be a disaster for you. And so the rest of the world is really helping to inform Americans by saying, don't fall for it, don't fall for it. It's actually better than what you have.
In 2016, you were an advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his sort of unlikely presidential run, where a lot of these ideas started to gain some traction, and his unexpected success in those primaries has seen not just Bernie Sanders this time round, but others, including Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, entertaining some of these ideas. How mainstream does it feel as though these things have become in the last sort of 3 or 4 years?
Oh, it feels very different. I mean, until he sort of created that space, people weren't talking about big, ambitious policies. You mentioned Senator Cory Booker. He's putting forward the idea of, a trust fund for every baby born in America sort of thing. I mean, this is the kind of thing that would have been unheard of in 2016, to have people pushing these big ideas, until Senator Sanders really got out there and said, why don't we have what the rest of the world has? Free public colleges and universities, health care, paid time off, vacation, sick leave, family leave, until he started to really tell America, this is what the rest of the world does. We can do these things too. We didn't think big in that way. And you're right, now it's sort of it's embarrassment of riches, in a sense, that people who are apparently going to run for president on the Democratic Party platform or as Democrats are putting forward these really big ideas.
You're huddling with Senator Sanders and a group of key advisors and backers next week in Vermont. Do you expect that he's going to run again, or if he can see that some of those platform ideas he ran on in 2016 are now in the hands of people who are maybe younger, more appealing to a more diverse electorate, for instance, than some old white guy from Vermont, that he might actually sort of hand the baton over?
Well, that white guy from Vermont is still the most popular politician in America. So,
and he's hurtling towards the age of 80 as well.
Yes, but he's younger than Nancy Pelosi. And, so we've got Elizabeth Warren, Donald Trump. They're all roughly in the same age demographic. I think the ideas that he ran on remain very popular. And, he's planning to introduce legislation for a federal job guarantee. That's coming out of him. I mean, he's still probably the biggest thinker, the most ambitious. Whether he decides to run or not, I couldn't say, but I think it might be a little odd if the most popular politician in our country didn't throw his hat in the ring.
Well, Stephanie Kelton, so good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Big, beautiful world.
Now, the Democrats in Congress have all kinds of trillion-dollar proposals on their wish list, but not every reform costs money. Take this story from a few months back about how Trump received at least $413 million in today's dollars from his dad's tax dodgers in the 90s, including instances of outright fraud. Now, maybe they'll investigate that. Fine, if they want to. But more than that, they should investigate how exactly the New York Times found those tax breaches, but the people who monitor tax payments, the IRS, did not. What they might find is, as this story from 2002 shows, the affluent have been avoiding scrutiny on their taxes for a long, long time. That's why in the 90s, the Trumps had one of their properties evaluated as being worth negative $5.9 million, even though city tax assessors that same year valued it at being worth $38 million. And they got away with it. Lots of rich people got away with it, and now they're probably getting away with it even more. You see, since the Republicans won Congress in 2010, funding for the IRS has dropped about 20%. And that money has come straight out of enforcement personnel, which since 2010 has been cut by a third. So, unsurprisingly, the tax audit rate has also dropped accordingly. That, by the way, is for individuals and businesses. It's gone down. In particular, the audit rate for people who earn more than $1 million is a third of what it was 6 years ago. And of course, less audits means less money recouped from audits. About $9 billion less raised just because of a $2 billion cut. It also means less criminal referrals. They've been almost cut in half over 4 years. And even when people do get caught, the IRS often doesn't have enough resources to waste on litigation, so they settle for almost anything. That's why when the Trumps swore under oath that their building was worth $17.1 million, but 18 days later they told the IRS it was worth $2.9 million, and the IRS caught them out, they just made the Trumps increase their valuation by $100,000 to $3 million. So just how much tax evasion are people getting away with? We don't know. The last time the IRS made an assessment was about 2010, and the gap then between tax collected and what taxes should have been paid was about $450 billion, or 3/4 of the cost of every federal department and agency combined. And that was before all the cuts to the IRS. But this is what we do know. We know that according to the Government Accountability Office, when landlords, farmers and sole proprietors tell the IRS how much money they make, their accuracy rate is just 37%. We know that one recent study found the wealthiest taxpayers pay on average 25% less tax than they owe, and that Americans have about $1.2 trillion of personal assets in tax havens. And we also know that the IRS estimates that every dollar invested in them produces $4 in revenue. Increasing IRS funding not only makes money, but it could literally make tens of billions of dollars. So the Democrats better get onto that one in their upcoming budget negotiations, because they need all the money that they can get.
Well, we are just about out of time for another week. But before we go, there was a bit of talk last week, Chaz, about the possibility of a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill. It was looking quite hopeful for, 48 hours or so, not so much now.
Hit an iceberg called Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell says there isn't enough time in the Senate, unfortunately, to pass this bill. Now, he's facing opposition from Republicans. Chuck Grassley, Lindsey Graham, who Trump likes a lot, Mike Lee, Tim Scott. They're saying, no, come on, let's make this work. Because they're trying to get some bipartisanship happening. They're saying, if we don't do it now, we'll do it with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats will get credit for it.
Right.
So we'll see what happens there. Also, interestingly, on bipartisan issues, Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna both presented a bill just now for a new kind of medicine pricing bill, where if there's a medicine, a drug that's under patent, they look at the price in other countries like Canada, Japan, Germany, France, UK, average the price. If the price in America is more expensive than that average price, the patent goes and they have to compete against generics. Now, the reason why that's bipartisan, potentially, is because Trump released a policy recently where they would do precisely that for Medicare Part B, which is hospital drugs. So with hospitals, for Medicare drugs, they would look at the average of prices, and if the average of prices in Europe was more expensive than the price on Medicare, they could reduce the price as well.
How do they get over? Because this has been something that Sanders talked about in 2016, etc. This idea that you could save a huge amount of money out of the health system by just making drug prices more competitive. The counter-argument, of course, is with big pharmaceutical companies, if they don't get that money, they won't invest in research and development. You won't get the next generation of cancer-curing drugs or something. So, unfortunately, Americans, the way the system works, Americans are paying for the world to get better drugs.
Yeah, but what they don't say is they spend more money on marketing than they do on research.
Yeah. Now, a quick note on Thanksgiving. We had the usual scene this week with President Trump pardoning 2 turkeys at the White House. What was it this year? Peas and carrots?
Peas and carrots, yeah.
Not very tasteful, I guess. Better than wishbone and drumstick, I think it was last year. But interesting about this, a couple of things. People assume that this is one of those traditions that dates back to, George Washington, pardon the first turkey. It actually dates all the way back to 1989. And George H.W. Bush.
Wow.
He was the first to pardon the turkey. Harry Truman, in the early 50s, he was the first to be given turkeys from the Turkey Breeders Association, but he ate them, as did every president, up to and including Ronald Reagan. It was only because of the Iran-Contra scandal that Reagan made kind of a quip in 1987 about maybe I should pardon the turkey. And that was in 89 that George H.W. Bush said, you know what, I'm going to pardon these turkeys. Again, because there were still indictments around people like Caspar Weinberger and others tied up with Iran-Contra. So that's why they pardoned turkeys.
So rather than pardoning the people, they pardon turkeys.
Exactly right. Yeah. The other thing to know as well is about these poor turkeys. Those turkeys, if they're bred just naturally and normally or in the wild, they weigh about 10 kilograms. The turkeys that Americans have on Thanksgiving, including those turkeys at the White House, are double that. They're about 20 kilograms. And these ones that are pardoned, they have a life expectancy of about 6 months. They go and live on a farm, but they die after 6 months because they are so incredibly unhealthy.
Be thankful you're not a turkey.
Yeah. Speaking of being thankful,
yes.
The president's been thankful, hasn't he?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the press asked him at the press conference just today, what are you most thankful for? And the president's answer will probably not surprise you.
Bye-bye.
For having a great family and for having made a tremendous difference in this country. I've made a tremendous difference in the country. This country is so much stronger now than it was when I took office that you wouldn't believe it.